Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Savannah, Georgia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know how far and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the archives of Chatham County, Georgia, there exists a collection of papers that few historians have fully examined. Most of these documents were sealed by court order in 1964, following a brief period when a graduate student from Emory University attempted to publish findings that the university later disavowed. The student, whose name was redacted from all official records, was said to have suffered a nervous breakdown during her research and abandoned academia entirely. What follows is pieced together from fragments that survived: letters, diary entries, property records, and newspaper clippings that paint a disturbing portrait of wealth, obsession, and the darkness that lurked behind one of Savannah's most respected families. The Witmore estate stood 3 miles outside Savannah proper, a grand plantation house built in 1798, its white columns visible from the Savannah River, where ships would pass carrying cotton, tobacco, and human cargo. In 1840, it was considered one of the finest properties in all of Georgia, owned by Judge Nathaniel Witmore, a man whose influence extended from the courthouse to the state legislature. The judge had 2 daughters, the eldest, Catherine, who had married appropriately to the son of another plantation owner, and Eleanor, 26 years of age, unmarried and, according to local gossip, increasingly unlikely to secure a husband despite her family's wealth and standing. What official records fail to mention is that Eleanor Witmore kept a private journal. 3 volumes were discovered in 1959, hidden inside a hollowed section of flooring beneath what had once been her bedroom. The university researcher who found them noted that many pages had been torn out and certain passages were heavily marked through with ink. But what remained told a story that contradicted the official narrative that had been carefully constructed by the Witmore family and preserved in Savannah's historical society. The first entry of significance is dated April 17th, 1840. Father has purchased 10 new field hands today. I watched from my window as they were led to the quarters. One man looked up at the house. His eyes held no fear, only a strange dignity that I have never before observed in any of our people. Thomas is his name, according to Mr. Reynolds. Born free in Pennsylvania, but captured and sold south, or so he claims. Father says such stories are always lies. In the months that followed, Eleanor's diary entries became increasingly focused on observations of the man called Thomas. According to plantation records, his full name was Thomas Avery, approximately 30 years of age, and purchased for $800, a high price that reflected his literacy and carpentry skills. The estate ledgers show that within 3 months of his arrival, Thomas had been reassigned from fieldwork to carpentry and repairs around the main house. Eleanor's diary, August 3rd, 1840. Thomas has been working on the broken banister for 3 days now. His hands move with such precision. Today I asked him where he learned such skill. He did not answer at first, then said only, "My father taught me, miss." When I asked of his father, he said nothing more. Later I saw him from my window. He stood alone by the oak, looking toward the river as if he could see something beyond the horizon that remained invisible to everyone else. County records show that Judge Nathaniel Witmore was absent from court proceedings throughout much of September 1840, having traveled to Charleston on business. During this period, the diary entries become more frequent and increasingly intimate. I brought books to the workshop today. Thomas can indeed read, though he pretends otherwise when others are present. His eyes betrayed his interest when I placed the volume of Mr. Emerson's essays on his workbench. A gift, I told him, though we both understood it could not be so simple. He asked if I wished something made in return. I told him only that I wished for conversation about the words therein, nothing more. What follows are weeks of entries describing clandestine discussions about literature, philosophy, and increasingly personal histories. Eleanor documented Thomas's story in fragments: his birth to free parents in Philadelphia, his education sponsored by Quaker benefactors, his capture by slave catchers while traveling south to reunite with relatives in Maryland, and the systematic erasure of his documented free status. Local newspapers from October 1840 mention a string of unusual events in Chatham County: the mysterious illness of two slaves on neighboring plantations who claimed to have seen a white woman walking alone near the slave quarters at night, a fire in a storage building on the Witmore estate that Judge Witmore blamed on outside agitators, and rumors of increasing patrols along the river following reports of attempted escapes. Eleanor's diary, November 2nd. We have spoken of impossible things. T says there are people who would help us reach the north. I told him he speaks madness, but in truth it is I who am going mad with each passing day in this house. Father has introduced me to Mr. Harrison again, making his intentions clear. I am to be sold in marriage just as surely as he purchases and sells others. A letter discovered in the personal effects of Judge Witmore's overseer, Samuel Reynolds, dated November 10th, 1840, and addressed to the judge himself, contains the first documented suspicion. Sir, I must bring to your attention certain observations regarding Miss Eleanor that cause me great concern. She has been seen on multiple occasions speaking privately with the carpenter, Thomas. Yesterday, Martha observed your daughter passing what appeared to be papers to him while he worked on the gazebo. I have not yet intervened, believing such a delicate matter should be handled by yourself upon your return from Atlanta. I await your instructions. No response from Judge Witmore survives, but court records show he returned to Savannah unexpectedly on November 15th, cutting short his business in Atlanta. The plantation punishment records, meticulously maintained by Reynolds, show no entries for that week, an unusual omission in a ledger otherwise comprehensive in documenting infractions and corresponding punishments of the enslaved workers. Eleanor's diary entries stop abruptly on November 16th. When they resume on December 1st, the handwriting appears shaky, the ink blotched in places. I am watched constantly now. Martha has been instructed to sleep in my room. I'm told it is concern for my health, that my nervous disposition requires supervision. Father speaks to me only of Mr. Harrison's continued interest despite my recent indisposition. The laudanum they give me clouds my thoughts, but I must appear to accept it, or they will send me away to grandmother's, as they have threatened. The diary contains no direct mention of what transpired in those missing 2 weeks of November. However, plantation records show that on November 20th, Thomas Avery was sold to a trader bound for New Orleans for $550, a significant loss on Judge Witmore's initial investment. This transaction was unusual in several respects. It was conducted with unusual haste. The buyer's name was recorded only as Smith, with no first name or address, and the sale was not published in the Savannah Republican, where the judge typically advertised all his business transactions. A curious entry appears in the diary of Catherine Witmore, Eleanor's sister, dated November 25th. Visited Eleanor today. Father says her melancholy is the result of a fever, but there were no signs of illness that I could detect. She barely spoke, staring out the window toward the river most of my visit. When I mentioned that several of the house servants had been replaced, she turned to me with such a look of hatred that I scarcely recognized my own sister. Mother says we must not speak of any changes to the household staff in her presence, as it agitates her condition. In early December, the Savannah Republican Society pages announced the engagement of Eleanor Witmore to James Harrison, the son of a wealthy cotton broker. The wedding was set for February of 1841. Eleanor's diary entries become sporadic and increasingly cryptic. Mother has commissioned my wedding dress. The seamstress took measurements today, as if fitting a corpse for burial. I smiled as expected. They believe the laudanum has made me compliant. They do not search my room as carefully now. A disturbing report appears in the records of the Savannah City Watch, dated December 28, 1840. Responded to claims of a white woman walking alone near the docks after midnight. Upon investigation, found Miss Eleanor Witmore, daughter of Judge Witmore, speaking with a Negro boatman. When questioned, she claimed to be searching for her maid who had run errands for her and not returned. The Negro man was detained and questioned, but released when Judge Witmore's house servant arrived to escort Miss Witmore home. Judge Witmore was notified of the incident. Following this incident, Eleanor's diary entries suggest increased restrictions on her movements and heightened supervision. Yet they also reveal a calculated adjustment in her behavior. I have learned to play their game. I speak enthusiastically of the wedding preparations. I have expressed interest in the house that Mr. Harrison is having prepared. Father watches me with suspicion still, but Mother is relieved and speaks of my recovery. Yesterday, I was permitted to ride out with only Martha as chaperone. We went as far as the Williams plantation. Their new overseer, Mr. Collins, was most courteous. County records show that in January 1841, a new overseer named John Collins had indeed been hired at the neighboring Williams plantation. What the records do not show, but what was revealed in a letter found in the 1950s during renovations of the old Williams property, was that Collins was not from Georgia at all, but a northern man with documented connections to abolitionist circles in Boston. On the night of January 23, 1841, multiple unusual events converged. Plantation records from 3 neighboring estates report hearing gunshots near the river sometime after midnight. The City Watch documented 2 ships departing Savannah ahead of schedule, citing favorable tides, and the Witmore household ledger records an unusual late-night expenditure to a doctor with no patient specified. Eleanor's diary, January 24th. It is finished. The blood will never wash from this house, though none will ever speak of it. They will tell themselves justice was done. Protection of property, defense of honor, words to mask the horror of what transpired. I'm to be confined to my room until the wedding. A month to prepare myself, Mother says. The doctor has been called twice to administer sedatives. They fear I might harm myself. They do not understand that I am already dead. What exactly transpired on the night of January 23rd remains unclear from official records. However, the Williams plantation record of worker assignments shows that John Collins, the overseer with northern connections, abruptly disappeared, listed only as departed without notice on January 24th. More telling is a cryptic entry in Judge Witmore's personal expense ledger, river problem resolved, $100 to Johnson Brothers. Local historians note that the Johnson brothers operated a fishing boat that was occasionally employed for discreet transportation of goods and sometimes people along the river. The wedding of Eleanor Witmore to James Harrison took place as scheduled on February 20th, 1841. Society pages described it as a most elegant affair, though they noted the bride appeared somewhat pale but composed. The newly married couple moved immediately to Charleston, where Harrison's family had business interests. Judge Witmore sold the Savannah plantation 6 months later, relocating his household to Atlanta, where he had been appointed to a higher court. For 3 years, the historical record of Eleanor Witmore Harrison remains largely silent, save for occasional mentions in Charleston society pages. Then, in April 1844, a brief notice appears in the Charleston Mercury. Tragic accident. Mrs. Eleanor Harrison, wife of cotton broker James Harrison, drowned yesterday when she apparently fell from the balcony of their East Bay home into the harbor during a storm. Mr. Harrison reports awaking to find his wife missing from their bed and the balcony doors open despite the inclement weather. Her body was recovered this morning. Services will be held at St. Michael's Church. The incident might have remained an unremarkable tragedy had it not been for a letter discovered in 1962 among the papers of Reverend Alistair Peterson of the Third Presbyterian Church of Philadelphia. Dated March 1844, just weeks before Eleanor's death, the letter bears no signature, but historical handwriting analysis strongly suggests it was written by Eleanor herself. Reverend Peterson, I write regarding a man who may have sought assistance from your congregation approximately 3 years ago. His name is Thomas Avery, a carpenter by trade, formerly enslaved in Georgia. I have reason to believe he may have reached Philadelphia following a route north through the Charleston harbor. If he lives, please tell him only this: I kept my promise. The child bears his name as a middle name, though none here know its significance. She will be sent north to school when she is of age, away from this place and all it represents. Do not respond to this letter. My husband's associates monitor all correspondence. Reverend Peterson's papers contain no record of any response, nor any indication that a Thomas Avery had ever reached Philadelphia. Church records do, however, show that in 1859, Peterson's congregation provided financial support to a young woman from Charleston seeking education in Philadelphia, one Elizabeth Thomas Harrison, who would have been 14 at the time of her arrival. Her subsequent history remains undocumented in any records that survived the archival sealing in 1964. The graduate student whose research was eventually suppressed reportedly located the graves of both Eleanor Witmore Harrison and her daughter Elizabeth. Eleanor's grave in Charleston is marked with only her name and dates. Elizabeth, however, was buried in a small Quaker cemetery outside Philadelphia in 1912. According to cemetery records, she never married, but worked as a teacher in schools for freed slaves following the Civil War. Her tombstone reportedly bore a curious inscription: she carried forward what others could not finish. In 1963, a construction project near the original site of the Witmore plantation uncovered human remains in what would have been near the river's edge on the old property line. Initial reports suggested they belonged to an adult male who had suffered significant trauma before death, including broken bones consistent with severe beating. A gold ring was reportedly found among the remains, unusual for an enslaved person to possess. Before proper archaeological documentation could be completed, however, the construction company, citing permit issues, reburied the area under several feet of concrete foundation. The medical examiner's preliminary report was sealed by court order the following year, along with all related documents. The researcher from Emory University who attempted to publish these findings reportedly began receiving anonymous threatening letters postmarked from both Savannah and Charleston. University officials, concerned about potential legal action from descendants of the prominent families named in the research, withdrew support for the project. The graduate student subsequently abandoned both the research and academic career entirely. The sealed archives are scheduled to remain closed until 2100, over 130 years after the events they document. By then, all direct descendants of those involved will almost certainly be deceased. Until that time, the full truth of what happened between Eleanor Witmore and Thomas Avery in 1840 and the exact nature of the river problem that Judge Witmore paid to have resolved remains a matter of speculation and whispered legend in certain historical circles in Savannah. Local river guides occasionally tell tourists about ghostly sightings of a woman in 19th-century dress seen walking along the riverbank at night, seemingly searching for something or someone in the dark waters. Historians dismiss such stories as typical tourist folklore, Yet the sealed archives and the abruptly terminated research project suggest that some stories from Savannah's past remain too disturbing for public acknowledgement, even after nearly 2 centuries have passed. Some secrets, it seems, are meant to stay buried in the muddy waters of the Savannah River, where the incoming tide still occasionally washes up fragments of the past before pulling them back into the depths. The student who discovered Eleanor's diary reportedly wrote in her research notes, before they too were sealed, a disturbing observation. The final pages of Eleanor's last diary volume contained the same phrase written repeatedly in increasingly erratic handwriting. He returns each night. The river cannot hold him. Below this, in what appeared to be a different ink, was a single line: I will join him soon. When the house that Eleanor shared with James Harrison in Charleston was renovated in the 1970s, workers reported finding strange marks carved into the wooden balcony railing from which she allegedly fell. Marks that one worker, whose grandmother had practiced folk traditions brought from West Africa, identified as symbols meant to guide the dead. Home. How such markings came to be there, and who might have carved them, remains yet another unanswered question in the tragic story of Eleanor Witmore and Thomas Avery. Perhaps some mysteries are better left unsolved, some voices from the past better left unheard, or perhaps, as Eleanor herself wrote in one of her final diary entries, the truth cannot remain submerged forever. Like a body in the river, it eventually rises to the surface. In 1968, all remaining physical artifacts related to the case disappeared from the university archives during a cataloging project. The official explanation cited administrative error. The graduate student who had been researching the case reportedly suffered a breakdown shortly thereafter and was institutionalized briefly before disappearing from academic records entirely. Attempts by subsequent researchers to locate her have been unsuccessful. The river continues to flow past the former Witmore plantation. The grand house with its white columns is long gone, replaced by modern development. But locals still speak of strange sounds, sometimes heard near the water's edge on January nights, sounds that some say resemble the desperate thrashing of someone struggling in the water, followed by a woman's anguished scream. The Savannah Historical Society maintains that the story of Eleanor Witmore and Thomas Avery is nothing more than local folklore embellished over generations. They point to the lack of conclusive documentation and the sealed archives as evidence that any claims of a scandalous relationship between a plantation owner's daughter and an enslaved man are merely sensationalized fiction. But those who have encountered fragments of the story, historians, archivists, construction workers who unearth strange artifacts along the river, often report a persistent uneasiness that follows them long after their discoveries. In 1951, a history professor from the University of Georgia attempted to locate descendants of the Harrison family in Charleston. His inquiries were met with closed doors and refused interviews. One elderly woman, claiming distant relation to the family, agreed to speak only on condition of anonymity. Her account, recorded in the professor's field notes but never published, described a family tradition of avoiding the water's edge after dark, particularly in January. When pressed for reasons, she reportedly said only, "Some betrayals leave marks that can't be washed away, not by time or tide or even blood." The professor abandoned his research shortly thereafter, citing health concerns. His notes, donated to the university library after his death in 1957, contain a curious addendum. "I have dreamed 3 nights now of a man standing at the foot of my bed, water streaming from his clothes, his eyes fixed on mine as if searching for recognition. I wake each time to find wet footprints on the floor that dry before morning." Eleanor's personal effects, supposedly preserved by her daughter Elizabeth, have never been fully catalogued. However, in 1960, a private collector in Philadelphia claimed to possess a locket believed to have belonged to Eleanor. Inside was not a portrait, as would be customary, but a small piece of wood, polished smooth, with the letter T carefully carved into its surface. The collector reported acquiring the item at an estate sale following the death of an elderly woman who had taught at schools for freed slaves after the Civil War, presumably Elizabeth Thomas Harrison. The locket's current whereabouts are unknown. The marriage records of James Harrison show he remarried 18 months after Eleanor's death. His second wife, Caroline Beaumont, of a respected Charleston family, bore him 4 children. Family correspondence from the 1860s suggests a strained relationship between these children and their half-sister Elizabeth. One letter from Harrison to his eldest son explicitly forbade any contact with your sister in Philadelphia, who has chosen paths that bring only shame upon this family. The exact nature of this shame remains unspecified, though census records confirm Elizabeth's occupation as a teacher at schools for former slaves, an occupation that would indeed have scandalized her southern relatives during Reconstruction. In 1872, a small notice appeared in a Philadelphia newspaper announcing a memorial service for those who sought freedom via the river routes of Georgia and South Carolina. The notice was signed by the Committee for Educational Advancement, an organization founded by Elizabeth Thomas Harrison. The service was to be held on January 23rd, the same date that gunshots were reported near the river on the night of the river problem that Judge Witmore paid to have resolved. Church records indicate the memorial service became an annual event, continuing until Elizabeth's death in 1912. Attendees reportedly included several elderly men who had escaped slavery before the Civil War, though no names were recorded in surviving documents. One account mentions an elderly carpenter who attended each year, sitting silently at the back of the room, leaving before the social gathering that followed. Whether this man had any connection to Thomas Avery is impossible to determine with certainty. The Witmore family's influence ensured that any scandal attached to Eleanor's name was efficiently suppressed. Judge Nathaniel Witmore lived until 1868, his reputation as a jurist and community leader unblemished. His obituary in the Atlanta Constitution described him as a man of impeccable character and unwavering principles. No mention was made of his daughter Eleanor, though his other daughter Catherine and her children were named as surviving family. It was as if Eleanor had been excised from family history entirely. Catherine Witmore's diary, which covered the period from 1840 to 1845, contained several redacted passages. The diary came to light in 1949 when Catherine's granddaughter donated it to the Georgia Historical Society. The granddaughter reportedly told the collections manager that she had found the diary in a locked box in her mother's attic, along with a note instructing that certain pages were to be removed before any public viewing. The collections manager, intrigued, held the diary to strong light and discovered that some of the redacted entries could still be partially deciphered. One such entry, dated February 1841, apparently read, "The wedding proceeded as planned, though E was hardly present in spirit. Mother says we must never speak of what happened by the river, that it is best forgotten for all our sakes. Father has arranged for the illegible brothers to relocate to Mobile with generous compensation. Reynolds has been instructed to tell the others that T was sold to a plantation in Louisiana. I pray that with time, E will forget this madness and find contentment in her marriage, though when I embraced her at the ceremony, she whispered words that chill me still. We are all accomplices now." The Johnson brothers, mentioned in Judge Witmore's ledger as being paid for resolving the river problem, appear in Mobile, Alabama records beginning in 1841 as owners of a successful fishing business. Their sudden acquisition of capital to start this enterprise was never explained in any surviving documents. By 1845, they had expanded to a small fleet of boats operating throughout Mobile Bay. Neither brother ever married, and they lived together in a house overlooking the water until their deaths in the 1870s. Local legend in Mobile claimed the brothers were haunted by something they had encountered on the Savannah River, though such stories are common among seafaring communities. In 1922, a writer researching a book on haunted locations in Savannah visited the former Witmore plantation site, by then divided into smaller properties. The writer's unpublished notes describe an interview with an elderly African-American man whose grandparents had been enslaved on the neighboring Williams plantation. The old man refused to approach the river's edge as evening fell. When I asked why, he said his grandmother had told him stories of a night when shots were fired and men dragged something heavy to the water. "Not everything that goes into that river stays there," he told me. "Some nights, especially in winter, you can hear chains dragging along the bank. My grandmother said it was the sound of judgment coming for those who thought their sins were washed away by the tide." The writer abandoned the project shortly thereafter. In a letter to his publisher, he claimed the research was taking an unexpected toll on his health and peace of mind. He relocated to California and never returned to Georgia. Her formal request was denied by the court, citing the original sealing order's provision that the records remain closed for the protection of the privacy and reputations of prominent Georgia families. This decision sparked a brief legal battle that ended when the university housing the records reported that certain key documents, including Eleanor's original diary, had been damaged by water during improper storage, rendering them illegible and of no historical value. This convenient degradation of evidence occurred just days before a judge was to rule on whether the records should be unsealed in the public interest. During the civil rights movement of the 1960s, a young activist investigating historical narratives of resistance among enslaved people attempted to access the sealed Witmore Avery records. The activist, undeterred, traveled to Philadelphia to seek information about Elizabeth Thomas Harrison's life and work there. Her research notes document a visit to the small Quaker cemetery where Elizabeth was buried. The caretaker showed me to the grave, which was well maintained despite the decades since her burial. Fresh flowers had been placed there recently. When I expressed surprise, the caretaker explained that every January 23rd, without fail, flowers appear on Elizabeth's grave, never delivered in person during daylight hours, always appearing sometime before dawn. "Been happening since before I started working here 40 years ago," he told me. "Always the same, white camellias and river reeds bound together with black ribbon." Camellias, notably, were a flower commonly associated with southern plantations. Their presence on a grave in Philadelphia, combined with river reeds, suggests a symbolic connection between Elizabeth's final resting place and her birthplace near the Savannah River. The black ribbon, in the mourning traditions of the 19th century, signified perpetual grief. The activist's subsequent research led her to a small collection of letters preserved by the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, with which Elizabeth had been affiliated. One letter, dated 1898 and signed simply E.T.H., contained a passage that seems to reference her parents. "As I approach the sunset of my life, I find my thoughts returning to the river, where two souls met and were then forever separated by the cruelty of man's laws and customs. My mother chose the water in the end, believing it would reunite her with what she had lost. I have chosen instead to live, to work, to create the world they imagined together but were denied. Some nights I dream of them walking together along a distant shore, finally free of the chains that bound them in this world." This letter strongly suggests that Elizabeth knew the truth about her parentage and her mother's relationship with Thomas Avery. It also implies that Eleanor's drowning may not have been the accident reported in Charleston newspapers, but a deliberate act, a suicide motivated by grief and the desire to be reunited with Thomas, whom she believed to be dead. The activist who uncovered this letter reportedly experienced strange phenomena during her research. Unexplained sounds in her hotel room, the smell of river water where there was none, and a recurring dream of a woman in 19th-century dress standing at the foot of her bed, motioning toward the window. She completed her research and published a brief article in an academic journal in 1967, but the article attracted little attention and was overshadowed by more prominent civil rights coverage. In 1982, renovations at the Charleston harbor uncovered the remains of wooden pylons believed to be part of the support structure for homes that once stood along East Bay Street, including the Harrison residence. Among the artifacts recovered was a small wooden box sealed with wax, containing a man's gold wedding band and a folded paper reduced mostly to pulp by water damage. Only a fragment of text remained legible. "Promised we would be free together, if not in this life." The box and its contents were sent to the Charleston Museum but were never displayed. According to museum records, the items were placed in storage pending authentication and conservation, but were subsequently misplaced during a cataloging project. They have never been located. In 2003, an archaeological survey conducted near the former Witmore plantation site used ground-penetrating radar to identify several anomalies consistent with unmarked burial sites near the river's edge. The landowner, concerned about potential delays to a planned development project, refused permission for excavation. The survey team noted in their report that the anomalies were consistent with informal burial practices rather than marked cemetery plots, and were located in an area that would have been just outside the plantation's formal boundaries in the 19th century, a location where an enslaved person might have been hastily buried. Local folklore in Savannah has incorporated elements of the Witmore Avery story into the city's rich tapestry of ghost tales. River tour guides sometimes tell of a phenomenon they call the January embrace, where the normally placid river becomes strangely disturbed around the 23rd of the month, with unexpected currents creating patterns that some claim resemble human figures reaching for one another. Scientists attribute such stories to normal tidal patterns combined with winter weather conditions, but the persistence of the legend suggests it has captured something in the collective imagination of the community. A librarian at the Georgia Historical Society, speaking anonymously to a folklore researcher in 2012, claimed that requests to access any materials related to the Witmore family, Thomas Avery, or the sealed archives were flagged for special attention, even in the digital age. There are still powerful families in this region with connections to that history, the librarian reportedly said. Some stories they prefer remain untold, even after all this time. Perhaps the most haunting suggestion of truth behind the legend comes from a maintenance worker who was employed at the Charleston house where Eleanor died. During renovations in the 1990s, he reported finding something carved into the wooden frame beneath the balcony flooring, invisible unless the boards were removed, but deeply etched into the support beam. His description, recorded in an oral history project about Charleston's historic homes, mentioned two names carved side by side with a date beneath them. When asked to recall the names, he said, "Eleanor and Thomas, I believe. The date was scratched out, looked like someone had tried to erase it. But you could still make out January 23rd. The worker claimed that his supervisor ordered the beam replaced immediately, despite its structural soundness, and the original was removed from the site and destroyed rather than preserved as would be customary in historical renovation projects. As with many historical mysteries, the full truth of what happened between Eleanor Witmore and Thomas Avery may never be known. The fragments that survive, diary entries, letters, newspaper accounts, oral histories, and the troubling pattern of suppressed evidence offer tantalizing glimpses of a narrative that challenges comfortable assumptions about the past. What seems clear is that something happened on the night of January 23rd, 1841. Something that the Witmore family paid to have resolved. Something connected to the river. Something that resulted in Thomas Avery's disappearance and Eleanor's subsequent psychological deterioration. The evidence strongly suggests a forbidden relationship between the plantation owner's daughter and an enslaved man, a planned escape thwarted by Judge Witmore's intervention, and a violent end for Thomas Avery, whose body may have been consigned to the Savannah River. Eleanor's apparent suicide 3 years later, Elizabeth's lifelong work with freed slaves, and the persistent memorialization of January 23rd suggest a legacy of resistance and remembrance that survived despite powerful efforts to erase it from history. Today, the waters of the Savannah River continue to flow past the site where these events transpired, carrying sediment that may still conceal evidence of what truly happened that winter night in 1841. The river keeps its secrets, revealing them only in fragments that surface briefly before being swept away by the relentless current of time. Those who study this case often report a strange sense of being watched during their research, as if Eleanor and Thomas themselves are witnesses to these attempts to reconstruct their story. Some have described dreams of standing by the river at night, hearing the approach of footsteps behind them, feeling a presence that seems to whisper, "Tell the truth. Remember." Perhaps that is all anyone can do now. Remember that behind the grand white columns of antebellum mythology, real human beings loved, suffered, resisted, and died. Their stories, even when deliberately obscured, leave traces that can never be completely erased, like the persistent memory of footprints along a riverbank, visible for a moment when the tide recedes before being washed away once more. The sealed archives are scheduled to remain closed until 2100. Until then, the story of Eleanor Witmore and Thomas Avery exists in this liminal space between documented history and legend, between fact and folklore, between memory and forgetting. Like the river itself, the narrative continues to flow, carrying fragments of truth that occasionally catch the light before disappearing again beneath the surface. In Savannah today, some still claim that on January nights, particularly when the moon is hidden and the tide is high, a sound can be heard near the former Witmore plantation site. The sound of a woman calling a name across the dark water, her voice echoing with grief and longing that time has not diminished. The name she calls, they say, is Thomas, and sometimes in the moment between the falling of one wave and the rising of the next, those who listen closely might hear a response.